Well, thanks so much. My God, what a great congregation. I mean, I had no idea. So it is an honor for me to be here. And as you have indicated, I've been at Cardozo Law School for 45 years. I can't even wrap my mind around that. And very early in my career, I was lucky enough to have Randy as my student in the clinic. And what was extraordinary about this is that Randy was in this criminal law clinic, trying a case, you know, managing editor or the law review or something like that, and doing, 12 different things. And she was just really a force of nature. And she's my friend, and I'm sure a distinguished member of this congregation, but I've had the pleasure of following her career for decades with enormous admiration. Her courage and intelligent leadership, especially during the COVID pandemic, protected teachers and parents and children all across this country and the world. Her direct influence touched my family in an important way. My son, Gabriel, interned for her and went on to work for Teach for America for 10 years and another wonderful organization called New Leaders, which helps mentor principals in underserved schools. And now he works for an organization called LIFT that takes whole families out of poverty. So I'm very proud of Gabe, but I thank Randy for putting him on this path so he would avoid being a lawyer. My daughter had no such luck. She's now working in the Bronx Defender, but what can you say? So the Innocence Project began as a law clinic at Cardozo in 1992. And years later, it became an independent nonprofit affiliated with the law school, and it's the headquarters of an Innocence network, which will celebrate its 20th anniversary in April at a meeting that I wish you could all go to, and we're going to have it this year in Phoenix, where you'll see hundreds of exonerated people and their families, and people that work in 71 innocence organizations within the United States and 13 abroad. So this has become an international human rights movement. And if you consult the Registry of Exoneration's website, which started at Michigan and is now at University of California at Irvine, you will see that since 1989, and we picked that date because that was the beginning of the DNA era where we could use DNA testing to exonerate people, there have been 3,228 exonerations in the United States alone. More than 29,100 years lost. And you should never lose track of that number. Black people are 13.6% of the American population, but 53% of the 3,200 exonerations listed in the registry. Judging from exonerations, innocent Black Americans are 7 times more likely than white Americans to be falsely convicted of a serious crime. Innocent Black people are about 7.5 times more likely to be convicted of murder than innocent white people. That applies equally to those who are sentenced to death and those who are not. The convictions that led to murder exonerations with Black defendants were almost 50% more likely to include misconduct by police officers than those of white defendants. And in addition, the average Black exoneree spent 3 years longer in prison before released than white exonerees. And I could go on, but this congregation and your wonderful work fighting mass incarceration, you get the point. In fact, our friends at the Registry of Exoneration issued a report on race and innocence that does a deeper dive into these numbers, if you're interested. Now, innocence organizations work to free the innocent, but we also, from the very beginning, have pursued an agenda of state and federal legislative reforms designed to prevent wrongful convictions in the first place. And these reforms are grounded in science, and they pursue an anti-racist orientation, whether it be for procedures conducting eyewitness identification. And, I should just point that out because we were really privileged to argue a case called Henderson in the New Jersey Supreme Court. And there's a wonderful chief judge that took a look at that case and really made it a vehicle for taking all the science that we had in the area of eyewitness identification, which includes the people that show the photo array of the lineup should not know who the suspect is, and you should give a warning that don't worry, when you look at this photo array or a corporeal lineup, you may or may not see the person that committed this crime. But don't worry, the investigation will continue. Just giving that warning reduces mistakes by 25%. And so similar kinds of scientific reforms are built into that law, and the chief judge of the New Jersey Supreme Court, who's very proud of his Jewish heritage, really went out and made that the landmark case, and it spread across the country, and we were able to get, either by court decisions or legislation, reform in, I think, about 70% of the country. And if you just think about that, we have prevented more wrongful identifications and wrongful convictions just by doing that, frankly, than any other thing we've done. And the same applies to videotaping interrogation. Our latest reform is to prevent the interrogators from lying to people that are under suspicion, particularly children. And, of course, unreliable forensic science. Last week, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, a venerable scientific institution that's really been helping us trying to reform standards in forensic science, finally issued a report on bite marks, which is complete junk science, but has put so many people on death row and in prison when there was never any scientific basis to it. It's completely astonishing. And I could go on about that. But as I began to think about this, I could give you more statistics, I could talk more about our agenda, but we're here in a very interesting and fantastic spiritual setting. And I want to just share a little bit about what I've learned and people in our movement have learned, and it's all from the clients, all right? Because, when an innocent person is exonerated, I'm sure you've seen it on television. Everybody goes, oh, my God, that person seems so peaceful. That person is not screaming and yelling and in a rage and cursing out all the different people that put him or her in that terrible situation where they lost all those years of their lives and, their families. Because as my friend Sylvia Barnes, the mother of Stephen Barnes from Utica, New York, taught us, every time you put an innocent person in jail, you put the whole family in jail. It's a circle of pain that radiates out for generations. But people ask, well, how do exonerees, deal with this? I will confess to existentialism, right? I am an agnostic existentialist, whatever that means. I saw Eric Fromm mentioned here in your Haggadah. I'm all for that. But, there is, that you can't deny it, a spiritual transcendence that our clients have. Because if you go to prison for a crime that you didn't commit, and strangely enough, all these people, because they're innocent, even though you look at the evidence and the jury and everything that's going on at the trial, they all think they're going to get off because they think it's a big mistake, and people are going to see that this is a huge mistake, and it's not true. They go to prison, if not, frankly, death row. And there's been quite a few innocents executed. I can tell you all about that. But the fact is that they will not survive unless they get over the anger. they'll be the first to tell you that. Because if you're angry and if you just can't get over the hatred, you will not make it. It will consume you. And so whether our clients are religious in any particular way or any denomination, I can tell you they have a spiritual transcendence. It's remarkable. So, I can just tell you that it's a good way to spend your time, to be involved in this work and have all these brilliant people working with you at our offices at 40 Worth Street and in our network all across the country, because we're lucky enough to be the headquarters of this network with, 71 innocence organizations in the United States and 13 abroad. But this was my world for the last few months, okay? So I was able to go to New Orleans, Louisiana, with the longest-serving staff attorney at the Innocence Project, the brilliant Vanessa Potkin, and we went down to work on this case of Darrell Henry. Darrell Henry, I think he was convicted at the age of 19. He did over 20 years in jail. He was facing execution for a while, and it was he was off in New Orleans looking for a job and could show all these different places that he had gone looking for work when a terrible crime happened in his neighborhood where there was a shooting, and then the shooter started trying to burn down the house, and there were a few different witnesses that thought they got a look. But the fact of the matter is, all they could remember, and they said as much, I saw the person in a red shirt, right? So the police officers, in their wisdom, created a photo array, right, including Darrell, and he was the only one in a red shirt. And so that's essentially how he got identified. And then later, after a number of years, we were able to get fingernail scrapings under his nails and a DNA test that exonerated him. But even when that happened, we were able to vacate his conviction, and it came back down to the lower courts, and a district attorney named Canizaro, who thankfully is no longer the district attorney in New Orleans. He's been replaced by Jason Williams, a progressive prosecutor and a friend. He was on the board, the chair of the board of the Innocence Project, right, before he became the district attorney in New Orleans. And we were able just in January, finally, to walk Darrell out of jail. And Darrell, man, this guy can rap. He's got raps, he's, hip-hop, he's everything, he's full of life. But when you talk to him, right, it's the same thing. You talk to him about what happened, and he was angry and infuriated about so many things, but he had that spiritual transcendence. And then, just 2 weeks later, I was privileged to go with Susan Friedman from my office and join our friends at the Hawaiian Innocence Project. Yes, there was a Hawaiian Innocence Project. And our friends Ken Lawson and Jen Brown. And we were able to exonerate a young man. Well, he's not young anymore, but he was also, I think, about 18 years old when he went in, named Ian Schweitzer. And Ian and his brother and another individual named Frank Pauline, who died in jail, they were all wrongly convicted. And what's astonishing about that case is that they were convicted of a horrible rape murder, but all three of them were exonerated by DNA testing of having been the source of semen and the vaginal swab of this victim. But the way the case evolved is that it went unsolved for 5 years, and the parents of the deceased Dana Ireland, understandably, were demanding that something be done and individuals be found, and the local police they were getting nowhere with their investigation, and the Attorney General's office was going to be called in. And then all of a sudden, they found jailhouse snitches, right? And the jailhouse snitches began identifying the Schweitzers and this other fellow, Frank Pauline, as having committed the crime. And then they did the DNA testing, and then they found out they were all innocent, and they went ahead and they prosecuted them anyhow. And Ian did 26 years until we finally were able to liberate him in January. And you talk to Ian, and Ian is a mixed-race Hawaiian, right? Same thing as Darrell Henry. Same kind of peace, same kind of feeling. And the bottom line here is really this. You talk to our clients, and they all feel all this pain must have a purpose, and they all feel that, you ask them, how did you survive? And they say, we could never quit. We could never give up. We could never quit. Our clients are the ones that survive, that transcend. They have resilience. And I wake up all the time, I'm sure you do, and I watch what's going on in Ukraine, and I watch what's going on in our country. And frankly, I watch what's going on in the state of Israel. And I am in sometimes deep despair. But just learn from our clients, right? Never give up. Keep fighting. And that's the only wisdom I have to offer you.
So I'm going to ask Rabbi James and Lori Magid to lead this session, to ask some questions and conversation, and then open it up. But first, I want Lori to introduce herself and tell us about your background and what you do professionally and your interest in this topic, and then ask the questions and have conversation with Barry, and then we'll open it up. Just when you ask a question, we have to have you use the microphone so everybody online can hear. And for those of you on the Zoom, we're going to ask you to put any questions into the chat. And Wyatt, who's working here, hi Sharon, nice to see you. Wyatt will translate the questions to us, and we can do it that way. Okay? All right, everybody understand? Okay, great.
Hi there. So I'm Lori Magid. I'm a CBST member, board member, and one of the leaders of the Ending Mass Incarceration team, and feel as privileged as I know all of you do to have one of my heroes and inspirations in the work that I do, which is I actually am a prosecutor and have been a prosecutor since 1986, which is a long time to be a prosecutor, starting in the Philadelphia DA's office, now as a federal prosecutor. But for me, the reason I'm involved in ending mass incarceration issues is because people like Barry and Brian Stevenson, who some of you also recall from our book readings, have really made me realize what should be obvious to everyone, that the criminal justice system makes mistakes. Some of them are intentional, and many of them are not intentional. The kind of eyewitness identifications that Barry was talking about. So I have in my career moved to issues such as clemency, pardons, taking a look at how long sentences are and should be. I spent the last year of the Obama administration on detail to the Pardon Office to work on the Clemency Initiative. And that was very meaningful in my life and changed my views about so many things and coincided with my greater involvement here at CBST. And has allowed me to work with Rabbi James, who is our social justice rabbi and director here. So I'm going to ask Barry the first question, and what I really want to say is the work you do, the Innocence work, is so inspirational, but in addition to the individual people that you're helping, I think what you have really done is made us realize that there are mistakes made in every aspect of the criminal justice system, not just for the innocent, but for the guilty as well, in the sense that maybe someone deserves a 5-year sentence, but why are they doing a 50-year sentence? So I'd like to kind of get your perspective on What are you most optimistic about now, and what are you most pessimistic about in terms of changes that should happen in the criminal justice system?
Well, can you all hear this? Okay. So I'm so glad you mentioned the fact that there are so many people in the system that were sentenced to ridiculous number of years in prison with mandatory minimums. You know, I started as a public defender in the South Bronx in 1975. You know, around that time, all of a sudden they started creating all these statutes, right, that put people away really forever. You know, that spread all across the country. And I think by any rational moral calculus, I think most people in this country would just not abide by those sentences anymore. And the question is, how do we get these people out of these maximum security prisons and, you know, bring them back into society? I mean, what a waste of human capital, if you want to look at it from just an economic point of view. So there are a lot of people doing this work, as you know, you and I have discussed. I was president of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and I'm still on the National the NACDL Foundation, which is like our charitable arm, you know, I've never left the organization, you know, because that did great work on all the clemencies in the Obama administration, and as you and I were discussing, you know, we all hope that the pardon, it would be nice if the clemency power was not directly in the hands of the Justice Department. It should be some kind of independent entity that makes these recommendations and reviews. A lot of us believe that my friend Rachel Barkow, who's a professor at NYU Law School, has written quite meaningfully about district attorneys' offices being able to go back and look, because you know, people age out of crime, right? I mean, there are people in prisons. There's no real danger when you look at it that they're going to go out and commit other crimes, you know. And so prosecutors, you know, should go back. And there's a statute now in California that allows second looks. I believe personally that the second look should be both something that the prosecutor can initiate as well as the defense, because we'll get better information out there quickly enough. And we have to just start going through the prisons and getting people out. You know, we know this, right, from all the works that's been done in the last 20 years about how we got to this horrible situation of mass incarceration. And because of our conversation, I made sure that I mentioned Angola prison, right? So Angola prison in Louisiana, you know, I've been there many times. Everybody there is doing life. I mean, it's completely nuts. In the state of Louisiana has incarcerated more people per capita than any country on earth other than Iran and Russia. Just think about that. And, you know, right now, you know, there's an effort to get them out. So, you know, Jason Williams appointed a woman named Emily Maw, who was head of the Innocence Project in New Orleans, and, you know, we're looking at a lot of these cases that came out of Louisiana because they had what they called non-unanimous juries, and the Supreme Court just found that unconstitutional. Why it took this long, I don't know. But the reason that they had non-unanimous juries, it was completely race, right? They didn't want, if, you know, heaven forbid, you know, a person of color actually got onto a jury in Louisiana to start with, or in so many states, they were afraid if one got on, that would hang the jury, right? So they had non-unanimous juries. And by the way, the results on these non-unanimous jury cases are, you know, the racial bias on that is astonishing. And a lot of those people turn out to be just flat out innocent. You know, you want to see the face of mass incarceration, go to Angola.
Thank you. I was struck by the story you told about this 18-year-old being incarcerated for 26 years and then being exonerated, and then also what you said about how the circle of impact on families and communities. I'm wondering if you could talk either about that case or about somebody else, or more generally, about what does rebuilding a life look like for people after getting out?
Well, this is in some ways been the hardest problem for our movement, right? Because how can you help people who have gone through this, I mean, it's like devastating experience. It's torture, right? When you're in a maximum security prison for all these years for a crime you didn't commit, right? And it is so hard on families, really hard. I mean, Dee Dee can tell you, our friend Reuben Hurricane Carter was just a great man, just a wonderful person. And when you see the movie, The Hurricane, you will see what he went through. I mean, it was an act of love that he kept on telling his loved one, don't come and visit me. That's not going to help me or you. Go live your life. I've been lucky enough to work, by accident, my co-founder and partner, Peter Neufeld, and I, we wound up starting a civil rights law firm. And originally we were representing Abner Louima, and we were doing racial profiling cases, and then the first really big wrongful conviction case we did was one that you probably have read about. It's the one that John Grisham wrote about in the book, The Innocent Man, right? It was Ron Williamson, our client Ron Williamson from Oklahoma, who came within 5 days of execution, and his co-defendant Dennis Fritz, who thank God wasn't sentenced to death. And, frankly, we would have started a civil rights clinic to work with the Innocence Project as well to help finance everything. But when we started doing that, it cost us, we took the Louima money and we put it on financing the Fritz and Williamson case. And I remember that cost $400,000 in expenses just up front to do it. And now you can run a clinic that way, right? All these years later, but then you couldn't because it became a remunerative form of civil rights case. And it should be, because if you're in jail for all these years, you should be compensated. Although there could be a more rational way of doing it. I can get into the civil rights laws and all the rest of it. I actually think it all should be done with insurance. All these municipalities should be insured. There should not be qualified immunity. There should be what they call respondeat superior liability. If the police or the prosecutor, right, committed acts of misconduct that violated the rights of the defendant and led to the wrongful conviction, then municipalities should get sufficient insurance and pay for it. That would help a lot. Unfortunately, a lot of jurisdictions like New York and Chicago, they're self-insured, right, for the most part. And then everything becomes political. Nobody's really going to ever tell you what I just told you. Because it's too rational to solve the problem that way. Although there's a very, very good book out now by my friend Joanna Schwartz, who is a law professor at UCLA, used to be a civil rights lawyer here in the city, and the book is entitled Shielded, How the Police Became Untouchable. And it's a deep dive into civil rights litigation and civil rights rules. It goes through a lot of the reforms that we all hope would have happened with the George Floyd Act on a federal level that never happened, but we can begin to do state by state, municipality by municipality. But she also agrees that a rational system of insurance would be able to at least compensate our clients, because what happens is we have a lot of clients that get out, right, and they have good cases. That is to say, they can get through the eye of a needle, and they show bad faith misconduct, that avoids qualified immunity, avoids all these bars. They get to sue, right? They can get in front of a jury, and then I absolutely guarantee you that any jury you ask in any kind of jurisdiction, if you say, how much is it worth to do a year in a maximum security prison, right? What would that be worth? They'll all say $1 million a year. And when you start looking at these people that did 10, 20, 30, 40 years in jail, it's a lot of money, okay? Now, I'm not saying that, everybody gets that when they finally get to a jury, but a lot of them get, close to that, or they can. And then municipalities will settle, right? Running the risk of that. And so it is much better for a plaintiff's lawyer to have an entity that's insured, right? Because then you can reason with them about the risks of trial. When you get to a political situation, people are nuts, because then they're politicians that are dealing with all this. So there is a way to do this. Believe it or not, Texas came up with the smartest way. When we began at the Innocence Project, we got more exonerations in the state of Texas. I'm sure you're not shocked by this in some ways than almost any other place. And the Republican legislature in Texas took a look at this and they said, you know what? We are going to give compensation through the state to anybody that's wrongfully convicted. And we're going to give them something on the order, I guess it's up to like $180,000 a year for each year that they were in, and then half of that for every year they're out on parole before they're exonerated. And we're going to give them, help them in the form of annuities, and that's what we're going to do. And that was calculated because when you get out, you have the option of filing a federal civil rights case if you've got the right case, and then you could get millions of dollars, even more than the statute allows. But the statute is exactly at the point, right, because it's no fault, right? It's exactly at the fault that a rational person who did all this time would say, I can get all this money now, I don't have to go through this litigation, which I could lose, right? I'll take it, right? That was, and that's what they did. So what I'm really saying is that, I actually say this in a lot of places and nobody believes it. We got a lot of reforms in Texas. We got a forensic science commission in Texas that's excellent, that got rid of a lot of the junk science. We just got that NIST report last week on bite marks. They did that 3 years ago, all right? We got a crime lab in Houston after a major scandal that is an independent nonprofit entity that is controlled not by the police, right? 90% of crime labs in this country, they are in the police departments, right? Which is crazy. And the people that are running them know that, right? They want to be an independent third force in the criminal justice system, right? And they can't be because they're stuck in police departments. So we got a lot of reforms in Texas. We got discovery reform, where you would get all the discovery digitally, right away, no disputes about whether anything was turned over, and very, very good rules. We got rules about punishing prosecutors, because we actually got to put one in jail in the Michael Morton case on a misdemeanor, but we did it. And so there's a lot of things about Texas that we could spread across the country.
Well, Barry.
It's a lot that's bad, don't get me wrong. They kill people, it's crazy.
You've had so many successes with improvements in forensic examinations and DNA. I do want to ask you about what I think must be some of the most troubling cases for you. I was at an Innocence Project presentation a few years ago in Philadelphia, where the speakers were the author and the man involved in picking cotton, where there was a not intentional but completely wrong cross-racial identification. when you have a case where you're positive that a person is innocent, that there's been a mistake made, but there's no DNA, is there, what can be done?
For a long time, right? People said, oh, the Innocence Project is going to end because now we're doing DNA on the front end, and, so you won't be able to use DNA to exonerate people. And by the way, we've been doing non-DNA cases for 15 years. And in our network, every innocence organization does DNA and non-DNA cases. And by the way, DNA technology has greatly improved, so we can do things that we never could, when we began this in 1992. But the people that you're talking about, it's a wonderful book called Picking Cotton, and it's by Jennifer Thompson, who wrongly identified Ronald Cotton. And so you asked, I'll tell you the backstory of the whole case. A friend of mine who is head of the clinic at the University of North Carolina Law School, Richard Rosen, was representing Ronald Cotton. And this woman who was sexually assaulted, named Jennifer Thompson, was an incredible witness. And Jennifer got on the witness stand. She identified Ronald. He was convicted in the first trial. By the time of the second trial, they had developed a lot of evidence that there was an individual named Bobby Poole who had similar sexual assaults, same MO, right, and looked a lot like Ronald Cotton. And they literally brought Bobby Poole into the courtroom, right? And Jennifer looked at Ronald Cotton and Bobby Poole, and she said, that guy, Ronald Cotton, is the person that did it. And when Jennifer testified, she would say, I was looking at my rapist, and I was concentrating on his face, and I'm a smart person, and I was going to remember it, right? So, again, Ronald Cotton was convicted a second time, at which point Richard called up and he said, the judge made an error. I'm pretty sure if I appeal this case, I can get a third trial. But what about this DNA testing? Do you think I should try it? And I said, well, it really works, right? So, Rich, I don't think it's your decision. I think it's Ronald's decision, right? It's sort of like every defendant has the right to testify if he or she wants to. It's their right. I mean, if a DNA test could prove you innocent, that's the client's decision. And lawyers, the way we are, we're going, oh, I don't know, my client may not be mentally competent to make this decision, particularly if, they're on death row. The death penalty lawyers were very reluctant to go along with any of this at first. But any event, so he did it, and sure enough, Ronald was exonerated. Now, Jennifer is an extraordinary person. I mean, that's kind of an understatement. And she immediately got involved with a number of our exonerees and went down to Texas to try to save the life of Gary Graham, a guy who was on death row and executed, and a lot of people believe, myself included, that he was mistakenly identified, but she got involved with the movement. And we had, as I mentioned before, and God, it's just, the chief judge in the New Jersey Supreme Court, his name eluded me for a moment. Isn't it, could somebody look, what? Graben or something? He's a wonderful guy. But we had all these reforms that were based on science because for years, psychologists had been doing experiment and eyewitness identification, in the lab, and they figured out a lot of ways to minimize errors. By the way, it's inherently cognitively difficult to make an identification. We know that 1/3 of the time, people make wrongful identifications. How do we know that? Because they pick fillers. In other words, you have a lineup or a photo array, they pick the person that's not the suspect that we know could not have committed the crime. So it's not easy in the first place. But we had all this science, and we needed to get people to understand it and start putting forward these reforms. And Jennifer dove in head first, and she would go everywhere. We would, be in the legislature in Georgia, in this state, and that state, and she would give a talk that described what it felt like to be sexually assaulted. And she lived it, and she went through it. And I was always so worried about her because I knew, she was re-traumatizing herself every time she gave that speech. But it was unbelievably effective. And we got all that legislation through. And Jennifer, paid a price, right? I mean, it really took a lot out of her. And she began to realize that the way we were dealing with exonerees, to get back to the original question, aside from the money, is that, really needed to have all the people in that circle of pain that are affected by the wrongful conviction as part of the process. So she has started something called Healing Justice. Jennifer and another, Katie Monroe, whose mother was wrongfully convicted, who was, part of our Innocence world. She used to run the Rocky Mountain Innocence Project. And the two of them formed this organization. And they would do retreats with, it really is restorative justice on steroids, frankly. They bring everybody in, that they can, the people that were, the persons harmed by the crime, the people that were wrongfully convicted, and they go through a whole process of trying to restore them and bring them back.
Is that an organization that's here in New York? Does it have a chapter here in New York, do you know?
Well, Healing Justice, I think it's in it's in the DC area or Maryland, but they do things all across the country. And so we have worked with Jennifer. The Innocence Project and Innocence organizations across the country to try to deal with this issue. But we've never been that successful in the final analysis. She's really, not everybody can get into Healing Justice or part of it, and not everybody can bring themselves to go there in the first place. And in terms of compensation, we've gotten compensation statutes passed in just about every state. Some are good, some are terrible. Remarkably, the one in Texas is the most generous one, but for reasons I described. We also, as soon as people get out, we have these provisions, I think, in Massachusetts and some states. You immediately have to get them to a doctor. People have terrible teeth after in prison. I can tell you all the different things that have to be done. So that is still the hardest problem. We haven't been able to solve it. And, we've never really gotten adequate funding. So each of the Innocence organizations tries to raise money itself. We do a lot of crowdsourcing, GoFundMe things when people get out. But it is, it's unfair.
Well, isn't one of the biggest problems that the exonerees are not even necessarily entitled to the kind of reentry resources of people who are
they don't
released from prison?
Yeah,
they don't get anything.
There are some terrific reentry programs, thanks to our friend Jeremy Travis and others. They all come home. This is a great book. There's a lot done there. And of course, when you're innocent, they say, goodbye, and I'm afraid you're going to sue me. It really comes to that.
So I do want to make sure that people have a chance to ask questions.
Yeah.
The hands are already shooting up. I'm going to come around and ask. I just want to remind everybody that a question is generally one sentence that ends in a question mark.
I'll try to keep the answer a little shorter. I'm not doing too well.
I'm going to here, and then there, and then here. Okay, I'm going to hold it for you.
Thank you. Oh, you're going to hold it, all right. Barry, quick question. You mentioned the pendulum was swinging. Have you noticed, because I look at polling, I've seen the polling on most of the country, crime is number 2 and number 3, and the politicians are responding. Is the pendulum going a little bit, the other way?
Oh, yeah, no question. It's after George Floyd was murdered, right? Foundations were providing money for, reforming the criminal legal system. The Innocence Project got money. Brian EJI got money. The ACLU got money. But because, I like to think we were comparatively safe. Who can argue with, getting innocents out of jail, although there are some United States senators. Did any of you see the confirmation hearing of Nina Morrison? Oh my God, you didn't see that? You ought to go look at it in YouTube. So Nina Morrison, I'm very proud to say, I think was our second longest serving lawyer in the Innocence Project. She's an openly gay woman, and she was nominated to be a judge in the Eastern District of New York by, our Senator Schumer and others. So Nina goes up for our confirmation hearing, and luckily, because we had done a lot of cases, in Florida and Texas and all over the South, and we had co-counsel who were members of the Federalist Society, because all my Federalist friends, work for Paul Clement and all these people. They say, we like it when you ask us to do pro bono work on your cases, because those are cases with the big J for justice. And by the way, they're terrific lawyers. It's great to have them on these cases. But Nina had some support from Federalists, and of course the progressive community. Then she goes before the Senate, and Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley what are they going to say to an innocence lawyer that's gotten, dozens and dozens of innocent people out of prison? They go, well, you got a lot of people out of jail in Philadelphia, and with your friend Larry Krasner, the progressive DA in Philadelphia, and they go, well, it's your work that has raised the homicide rate in Philadelphia, right? They actually said that, and they kept on saying that. And I must tell you, I think Nina's confirmation hearings, they weren't the first sign, but they were a very strong signal that the backlash was coming, right? And so it's out there. The foundations dried up. We had all these incredible, criminal legal reform projects. One that, I'm particularly focused on, which is using police misconduct databases, is an extremely important thing to do, because we can begin to track those officers that had acts of misconduct that were secret, that we never knew about. We started getting that funding, and it sort of disappeared, but that would be very, very helpful. I can give you a whole bunch of things that should be done and are not done yet. Yes, the answer to your question, it is now a very tough environment. However, you have to go state by state, municipality by municipality. So when you look at Joanna Schwartz's book, we can get rid of qualified immunity in Colorado, in New York City, but not the rest of the state. You go place by place. You have to be an incrementalist at this point in time. On even some of the most obvious things like, chokeholds and other things. So yes, it's a very tough environment. It's swinging, but let me tell you, I just came from Memphis, Tennessee. And in Memphis, Tennessee, a lot of us worked extremely hard to elect Stephen Mulroy as the district attorney in Memphis, to eliminate Amy Wyrick. Now, our friend Emily Bazelon wrote a great book called Charged, where she compared Eric Gonzalez, the district attorney in Brooklyn, who's done a lot of great things, to Amy Wyrick, probably one of the worst district attorneys in the United States. And so In August, Steve was elected district attorney in Memphis, which was no small trick. And you can see the difference that makes. Because when the Tyree Nichols case came, I don't think there's anybody that thinks that he didn't do exactly the right kind of job. The way that he released that information, the way he made that clear to the public, brought those charges right away, prevented riots, did a terrific job. And that makes a big difference. So you can elect them in Memphis, you can elect them in a lot of places.
Thank you.
How do you identify the cases that you're going to go? How do people get to you?
Oh, God. We have huge backlogs. In the early days of just the Innocence Project in New York, when we were doing DNA, we had a pretty simple test, which was if DNA can prove you innocent, we'll take your case. And then we'll try to go out and find the evidence and do everything like that. We now have, we do non-DNA cases. We always took death penalty cases right away and put them at the top. But we now are trying to build some predictive analytics. Everybody says, oh, we can do that very easily for you. It's not so easy. That's one reason I come back to the police misconduct data. We can't prove this yet, but I would bet that the two factors that I think would be predictive of who you could get, where you can get a conviction vacated. Not saying, innocence, but a fast way to find cases where you could vacate a conviction for people that are claiming innocent would be a case where there was previously undisclosed police misconduct and a lawyer that, had been frequently sued for ineffective assistance. Those two things together, I think, might be a pretty good predictor. But we also look at all the factors that lead to wrongful conviction. We know when eyewitness identification procedures are bad. We know about false confessions. We know about a lot of the junk science. We can move those to the top, but it's not easy.
But how do you know that it's been a wrongful conviction in the first place?
Well, number one, somebody has to write to us and say they were innocent, right? You start with that. And by the way, that is usually a pretty good indicator. I'll tell you what's even a more amazing indicator. If they've turned down parole, right, rather than admit guilt. That's a fantastic indicator. But that's how we do it.
Thank you. I'd love to take a question from the folks online.
So Sharon Golub was going to ask.
Sharon Golub is going to ask one of the questions from online.
Hi, hi, everyone. I'd like to thank you, first of all, for being our guest speaker tonight and for the wonderful work that you do. I have a question from Rev Kat Katsanis Semel. She says, firstly, thanks so much for your crucial work. Secondly, once one of your clients is out of prison, are there any wraparound services that are provided? That is, do you all help them to transition back to society at large? She then said to clarify this, she doesn't mean financial services, rather, I mean mental/emotional health services.
Yes. So the answer for our organization, the Innocence Project, which has more resources than a lot of the other organizations in our network, although a lot of them do exactly what we do. We have a full-time staff of social workers. We have exonerees who provide assistance, but we provide those kinds of mental health services as well as immediate funding for housing, for transportation. So we do all of that. But it's limited, right? We'd like to make it more, but we do that for every one of our clients.
Thank you. I have one more question, Rabbi James. Is that all right?
We can take one more, sure.
Okay, great. Monica Raymond asks, when you talked about the Schweitzer case in Hawaii, you said they had DNA evidence that Schweitzer was innocent and they imprisoned him anyway. What happens to the law enforcement officials who perpetrated this?
Well, It was ridiculous. You know, if you want to see what that trial looked like, Bill Curtis did a documentary. It's 45 minutes called Murder in Hawaii, where they actually show the trial. It was on Court TV. I mean, it's kind of insane because all the snitches came in and they focused on these three guys, okay? It's a very complicated story. Then they did DNA testing. Then they dismissed their indictments. And then they got more snitches and they re-prosecuted them. Because, you know, they had committed themselves to this theory because they had nothing else, and they suppressed all kinds of, they ignored plainly exculpatory evidence again and again and again. So how they convinced themselves of this is, we'd have to go get Daniel Kahneman, right, and Tversky to do an analysis of how they could. But I think it's actually pretty simple. I think they knew that they had the wrong people, or they had good reason to believe it. And what was more important, you know, admitting that they made this colossal error in the most publicized case in the history of Hawaii. That's not an exaggeration. They ran around on the Big Island where this took place, and they had wanted posters up for all of the Schweitzer family in this whole community. I'm amazed that they survived this. But you know, I'm very pleased to say that when they were exonerated in January, enough time had passed and the evidence was so persuasive, I think, that you know, people have begun to accept the fact that it was a colossal miscarriage of justice.
Thank you so much, Barry. I want to, first of all, just say, like, this is really an honor, really. Like, since pre-COVID, we've been waiting for this. And hearing these stories and hearing about what you've learned from the people you've worked with is deeply, deeply meaningful. I'm very, very grateful. Is there a last thing you would like to leave us with?
Well, I'd just like to say that I didn't know what to expect when I came here. And I am just so thrilled. I can't wait to go through, you call it the prayer book?
Yes,
The
Rabbi
prayer
Kleinbaum
book?
gave Barry a copy of the Siddur and our 40th anniversary book because you need to know us better, clearly.
Yeah, but I'm just so inspired by this community, and it makes so much sense to me because, I'm sorry? Well,
This is the membership committee is pressuring Barry to join, yes.
I would gladly join, but I'm not, I'll come back
It's
because
okay, you're not on trial.
I really don't like organized religion in general, but this is different. No, I understand, but I'm so glad that this community came together. I lived for 10 years on Perry Street, right? You know, right in the, you know, opposite, I guess it was Fiddlesticks or Uncle Charlie's downtown, right near the hospital. And you know, at the height of the AIDS epidemic. And so many friends and so many of my neighbors, you know, died in that plague. And just watching all of that, you know, you just think, thank God that there was, you know, there was a community of people, you know, a place to go. You know, I can't believe I'm reading in your prayer book a whole thing on coming out. That's so cool. I just, so thankful that you invited me. I really feel honored.
Well, how can we
Thank you.
support your work? Could you do a plug?
Well, you
Yeah,
know,
is there a way we can support your work?
There's you know, look at the, you know, we're always looking for volunteers, you know, we have a link, and you know, people, there are a lot of people working at the Innocence Project at 40 Worth Street, and that can connect with other Innocence projects, and you have friends and relatives across the country. Tell them to look up one of the Innocence organizations in their area, and just get involved. And
We're going to take you up on that because
Okay.
we do, you know, one of the reasons. one of the reasons we wanted to have you here was just to inspire people on our team here, online, and elsewhere to come help us with our reentry efforts, helping people who are exonerees and people who are just getting out of prison transition back. That's one of the focuses of our team.
Well,
So
that's fantastic.
we will follow up on that.
Okay.
Thank you so much.